is Historic Preservation Month, and we have our village historian with us this evening to make a presentation regarding the activities, or at least the significance of the month. So Lynn Martin, would you please take it from here?
That mic's on, and you can tell me when to change the slide. Okay.
So I was just going to highlight one building in the village. I've had people ask me questions about it, and also Cynthia Hout from the Landmark Society contacted me because she knows a lady who has done a lot of history and documentation on opera houses, and that was a building that had an opera house. So I wanted to put together a little history on that building because it is Preservation Month and it's good to preserve the history, right? So as you recognize that building up there, that's a recent one. So that's 5 to 7 East Main Street, and I'm going to talk about what it was, well, what its history was. You can change the slide. Okay, this is the original building that sat on that property. This was Safford Mason bought this property, as far as I can tell, from a Mr. Pratt. And if you can look in the background, you can see the Corning House, which is now the Willard Scott Funeral Home, and that faces South Avenue. And you'll also notice that the Hawley block, the corner store where Jeff's computer is today, that hasn't been built yet. So Safford ran that, and his son George eventually took over, and he tore it down. Now this photo is, the photo was taken, it has to have been between 1875 and 1880, which is kind of, that's one of the earlier photos that I think I have. You can turn to the next slide. And this is George Mason. I have quite a few different photos of him. We're very lucky to have a lot of history on him. He was a very influential businessman in the village. Next photo, please. So this is, okay, yeah. George built this building. He tore down the original one and built a 3-story structure in 1884, and it was known as Mason's Hall. It had 3 stories. The main floor was the drug and general store. The second floor had a large room known as Mason's Hall, where most public meetings were held, including town elections. The top floor was known as Mason's Opera House, where musicals, plays took place, and lodges held their meetings. In 1900, George sold the business and building to Dr. Elva Main and J.R. Hawley because he went into the banking business in the village. You can see the corner building has been built. That was built in 1880. That's right next door to it, right at the 4 corners. You can turn to the next slide. This is the interior of the original store that George built, and that's George behind the counter. The next one, that's on the east side of the building, and the next slide will show the other side. Next slide, please. This was taken during the 1895 campaign for president with William McKinley and Garrett Hobart as his running mate. You can see the next door house. It's hard to see because this is a small screen. The next door house just past George's building was part of the property. I believe it was purchased by Safford as part of the whole parcel. And that was later the site of the Jane and Mason Bank. You can turn to the next slide. This slide photo was taken shortly after 1906, after the Jane and Mason Bank was built. You can see it right there. And that was built in 1906. This shows a 3-story building after Dr. Main and J.R. Hawley were operating the drug and general store. George Hawley had not yet sold his business to George H. Whitmer, and a lot of us remember the Whitmer store. And he sold it to the Whitmers in 1907. You can see the post office between the bank and George's three-story building. George built that, I think, in 1898. I think they had changed the laws concerning postmasters, because a lot of them had, they collected the mail in their own personal businesses. And that was kind of not a good idea anymore, so George went ahead and added on to his building and built a post office, which is now full insurance. The next slide, please. So business, once again, this is 1907, I believe. The business changed hands and was called Harris and Leedy in 1907. In 1913, Mr. Leedy bought both the business and the building from Mr. Harris. In 1925, Mr. Leedy divided the store and sold the drug stock to Mr. Frank Lucas. Mr. Lucas was able to purchase the building in 1946. He paid Arthur Leedy with half the price paid in quarters that he had saved in a piggy bank. Now, the next one, please. This is just another early view of that building. It's not quite as ornate as I guess as it was originally. The next one, Frank sold his entire stock from the drugstore in 1968 to Walter Wiener. Wally had purchased a small corner store business of pharmacist Milton Case, which was on the corner of Lapham Park and East Main Street, also in 1968. So circa 1970, the owner removed the third story of the building, which was the original Opera House. It's unknown if Frank Lucas still owned the building at that time or if he sold it around 1968. And the Tausch family may have purchased it from Frank. I can't say that's a fact. These are photos of the top being removed. And also the other photo at the bottom shows the interior of the building as they were. They had windows completely all the way around. There are a couple of photos that were taken from probably the roof of that building. So you can get a really nice, it's like an aerial view. There's only 2 of them that I know of that would have been taken from that building. According to Carolyn Cortori, who lives here in the village, she was a pharmacist who worked for Frank. She remembers Frank taking her upstairs to the 3rd floor and seeing a stage at one end. The museum has one of the lanterns that lit the upstairs at one time. According to a friend of Frank Lucas, they were around the room to provide light. We have one at the museum, donated by Frank's friend. And then the last photo is after the top was removed. That's an early renovation. And I don't know, maybe some of you guys can give me a date on that truck, but I'm thinking it is 1970 something. And Tausch Travel is in the building. So there are still a couple of mysteries to solve, but it is a building with quite a bit of history. And we're lucky to have as much as we have on the Mason, George Mason. So anyway, that's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Nice.
Very nice.
Interesting to see the progression. It's interesting to see the progression of horse, then I think bicycle to truck or car vehicle very early, and then to end up with cars and modern trucks.
Yeah.
Progress. Also from a dirt road to a paved one.
Yeah.
Very interesting progression. Nice history. If you don't mind, Peter, I'll read it. I have a proclamation, Historic Preservation Month proclamation, and I would like to read it in whereas historic preservation is an effective tool for managing growth and sustainable development, revitalizing neighborhoods, fostering local pride, and maintaining community character while enhancing livability. And whereas historic preservation is relevant for communities across the nation, both urban and rural, and for Americans of all ages, all walks of life, and ethnic backgrounds. And whereas it is important to celebrate the role of history in our lives and the contributions made by dedicated individuals in helping to preserve the tangible aspects of the heritage that has shaped us as a people. And resolved that I, Darrell Byers, Mayor of the Village of Webster and the Webster Village Board of Trustees, do recognize May 2021 as National Preservation Month and call upon the people of the Village of Webster to join their fellow citizens across the United States in recognizing and participating in this special observance.